systems thinking in some form in your work today? What? Okay. So this is a very narrow slice of systems thinking that I'm about to talk about, which is basically around systems mapping and causal loops. But I think what I'd like to share with you are some of the methods that I've developed in our practice at Artefact, which is the consultancy that I work for. We do a lot of diverse work within different domains like healthcare, education, technology, emerging technology, and I think a thread in the work that I conduct for them. Ooh, I have a little bit of a lag here. This is like an airport bookstore up here. I just noticed these like weird books. We believe design, technology, and innovation can lead to a better future. Sorry, I get like a little easily distracted when I'm giving talks, so try not to do anything weird. I think that part of making sure we can accomplish the lead to a better future piece is making sure we ask the right questions, understand the right context, and basically know what we want to change from the status quo. So as I've been working with clients lately and kind of thinking about the design practice, it's led me to interrogate a little bit what we do when it comes to user-centered design. So this says, yes, the planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we created a lot of value for shareholders. And I was like, oh God, this like hits so close to home. But I think part of it is that we're not explicitly designing for the outcomes we want to see in the world, and especially from a societal perspective. Oftentimes, we're designing directly for benefit of use. So talk a little bit about that. Basically, if you look at the way design has been conducted over the last, century or so, we've often been oriented around the product. So we design things that are appealing and easy to use. So think about like a great piece of furniture, a great chair, a great radio. As we sort of entered the digital realm, we started designing touch points that create a desired experience. So this could be basically orchestrating, let's say, imagine your banking experience. There's digital touch points, there's customer service, there's also physical branches where we still have those. And so you're orchestrating across those things, and basically it's kind of the tenets of service design, right? And now I'm thinking a little bit more explicitly about designing for outcomes. So designing experiences that contribute to positive societal outcomes. Now, what does this mean, and what does this mean for the design practice? I like to use this example of Twitter. A couple of years ago, they did a redesign, and they said, they kind of made a lot of noise about it. Their VP of design posted and said, we're refreshing our product and making it feel lighter, faster, and easier to use. We listened closely and kept what you love, and for the things you didn't, we took a new approach to fix and make it better. And so they did a lot of things. It's really like jittery because it's not connected directly, but it was a lot more fluid interactions, shortcuts that didn't exist before. And actually, as somebody who uses Twitter, I found like the changes like pretty appealing. And it was kind of funny because if you look at the reaction on the platform, people were like, can you just kind of like get rid of the Nazis and forget the round avatars? So it really felt like, rather than considering the broader goal of making their platform safe, they were kind of in this narrow headspace of making it easy to use for an individual user without the context of how they use it with others, which is kind of crazy if you think about a social media platform. And newsflash, there's still Nazis on Twitter. So I don't think they've solved this. 2 years ago that this was happening. So just to reiterate, considering outcomes forces us to think beyond the direct benefits of use. And I've been thinking about this a lot lately in the context of my work. So a team of very talented practitioners, and a marketing manager, Hannah Staten, and Jeff Torkelson, who's one of our design strategists, came up last year with the Tarot Cards of Tech. And what these are prompts that help companies to think about the unintended consequences of their products. And so we think about scale and disruption. The categories are scale and disruption, access, and usage. So things like, what does using your product too much look like? And these were born of questions we ourselves were asking with our clients, and so we kind of designed them for ourselves and then released them more broadly, and it resonated with different kinds of organizations, everyone from social impact to technology companies to startups. I've also been working on being more explicitly outcome focused, so thinking about things like how can we map to outcomes or start with outcomes first and then design backwards from that. So basically, when I do this exercise with companies, it's kind of thinking about what's the impact that you want to have, instead of saying like, well, we need an app and we expect the app is going to do this. Because it's possible that the outcome that you want to achieve can be achieved by other means. This kind of format is simplified, but it's borrowed from essentially some of my sort of nonprofit and public sector clients who use tools like theory of change. So borrowing from this to add to the design practice, I think, is a really valuable exercise. We can learn from other, we can definitely learn from other disciplines and apply it to our own work. So I started, even though we've been doing this with tools that are directly related to products and product design, I was wondering, like, how can we consider the systemic impact of our work? Like, what about stakeholders and effects that are a few degrees past the users or the context that we're thinking about, or the context that our products and services are used? And I know that, many of us, as kind of displayed earlier when I asked, we use systems thinking in different ways. So we do things like stakeholder mapping. This was a map that I created for one of our clients who, has created a public data platform. And what it shows is that even if you're trying to reach citizens, you might need to design for government staff, journalists, or researchers, and your users are very different than the people who are going to benefit the most from your work. And we also do things like ecosystem mapping. So this is a series of basically the landscape of hospitals in India. So you have public hospitals to small private hospitals, and sort of the impact on different players within that ecosystem. And then I know many of you have probably done service blueprints, which are their own form of system. What I've been thinking about, though, that's kind of like missing from this mix are things that are really specifically around cause and effect. And I've been thinking about the Cobra effect, which was something I discovered as like a kid, and it's been surfacing for me as I've been doing this work. Does anyone know what the Cobra effect is? Okay, so it's basically 19th century British colonial army. They put a bounty on dead cobras that were turned into them because they're trying to reduce the cobra population. And so people started turning in dead cobras, and the cobra population reduced. And then suddenly they noticed an uptick of the number of dead cobras that people were turning in, like, wow, there's a lot of cobras that, how is this happening? And it was because people were breeding cobras in order to kill them so that they could turn them in for the bounty, thereby increasing the cobra population, the wild cobra population. So it backfired horribly, and it kind of flew in the face of the original intent. And that's because they didn't have a good understanding of how what they were doing would have an impact once it was out of their control. And also, I think, the French colonial army did this too in Vietnam, trying to get rid of rats. So the same thing happened, where they put a bounty on rats, people turned in rats, people started breeding rats, and the rat population exploded because of this bounty. So I guess like the message is that, colonialism is bad. Like, because of this, but also you can just stop it, colonialism is bad. I had forgotten about that rat example. But I was thinking, there was another example just the other day where, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, yeah, Steven's nodding his head. I read about how plastic bag bans actually increase our use of plastic, because people were reusing plastic bags to do things like line their garbage bins, pick up dog poop, and now what they do instead is they buy garbage bin liners which use far more plastic, and so our use of plastic actually increases. So these are the kinds of like causal effects that I find really interesting, and I was trying to figure out a way to integrate this in our analysis of understanding the context in which products and services happen. So I wanted to think about this. I had like some time and the freedom to do a research project last year, and I wanted to think about social media. It's an example of a good, like big, like large ecosystem that has multi-layered impact, and the possibility for causal loops is pretty like broad in terms of like the impact it has on society. So I was thinking about Facebook, and their mission statement is to give people the power to build community and bring the world closer together. I just have a feeling a lot of people aren't feeling that right now, that they're actually doing a good job of accomplishing their mission statement. So with that in mind, I did a systems understanding research project to try to understand the impact and to use, sorry, it's like supposed to like slow out gently and instead of like, to basically like how social media works. Kind of asking ourselves, like, can this kind of system be saved? Like, what kind of impact is it having on the world today? And what kinds of interventions could be designed to create a different landscape? Now, I was kind of like, this is the sort of thing that I could spin out and go to like the edge of the universe and back and spend months doing and never get anywhere. And so I started thinking about like, what's the best way to, I don't know, to sort of provide me and the researchers that I was working with some constraints. And so we use this framework where the first thing we do is use systems mapping to understand the status quo, use that, so understand like the cascading effects of what's going on in a system, as well as like the symptoms. Then use that to identify root cause, or kind of like the deep structure of your systems map, and then use that understanding of root cause to prioritize types of interventions. Now, this isn't like a super, like systems thinking is like a super deep and rigorous practice. Donella Meadows kind of wrote the book on systems thinking in the 70s. If you want to think about like stock and flow and feedback loops and how you disrupt them, you can use that as a resource. In my research on this, like I came to understand a lot of that, but I found it just like way too technical for what we were doing. So we wanted to kind of simplify the approach a little bit. So I can share some of the ways that we did causal loops. So first, we look at understanding the status quo, and to kind of provide ourselves with further constraints, we wanted to understand the impact of social media on individuals, communities, and society. And so there's 5 layers, and this is taken from the UNICEF social ecological model. So you have personal effects, interpersonal effects, community, organizational, all the way up to policy and enabling environments. And so we wanted to look at these different layers of impact. And I think this, like, I have a video, but I think it's gonna just like freak the hell out right now. So I might actually try and skip it. But basically, what we did, this is actually on the Artefact website as well. This is our space. Like, we took it over because we started doing this, and this is Gabriel Biller, who's like, just like an amazing design researcher, and we worked together on this for about a month, and we started creating causal loops digitally, and then we were just like, oh my god, screw it, this is like too crazy, like let's just like do it with post-it notes on the wall, because then we can like take them down and sort of draw connections between them and stuff. And it just kind of like made it a little bit more like we were totally immersed in this. Like, we interviewed academic subject matter experts, And at one point, I literally had like 298 tabs open on my phone when we were doing the research for this, and I was like, this is an illness, I have to stop. I did that thing, like beautiful thing where you just like hold it down and then everything just goes away, and I was like, oh my gosh, I feel free. And so we ended up doing this, yeah, it's gonna be like jittery, but we ended up creating this systems map digitally after we had it kind of all the connections figured out, and analyzed it by way of those 3 categories that I talked about before. And I know these things will be a little hard to read, so I'll kind of like read them out to you as we go through them. And you can also, I wrote a white paper about this, so you can download the white paper at our website. I have the link to it at the end. So if we think about the individual impact, there was this article 2 years ago in The Atlantic written by this researcher, Jean Twang, who does a lot in terms of digital impact on teens and young adults. And basically what she deduced was 8th graders who spend 10 hours or more a week on social media are 56% more likely to say they're unhappy than those who devote less time to social media. Moreover, when teens have more engagement online and fewer interactions in person, feelings of depression and loneliness increase. And so we found that to be consistent with some other research that we were looking at. So we created this causal loop, and when you're creating a causal loop, you think about increases and decreases in what's happening. And so to do a closed loop, we could start, for example, with time spent on platform reduces the time spent in meet space, well, real life. I don't know how meet space has stayed in there so long. It was on, I wrote it on a sticky note to be funny, and then like it made it all the way to like our final deliverables. But to be more accurate, it's a reduction in time spent cultivating interactions in meet space. And then that leads to an increase in seeking more online interactions, which leads to an increase of feelings of depression and loneliness, which leads to an increase in time spent on platform. One of the professors that I spoke to, she said she knew this YouTube engineer who actually quit the company because of their metrics. So he was like, they just keep pushing for more people to watch more videos and longer videos for longer amounts of time. And he was just like asking a lot of questions about it, and it just seemed like there was nothing else that mattered. And so he actually ended up leaving before being able to make any change. Now, we did a bunch of these causal loops at the individual level, and then we also did them at the community level. So if you think about that framework from earlier, individual, community, and society, where's my causal loop at? So again, we're starting on time spent on the platform, leads to an increase in personal data collection, leads to an increase of the use of proxy data for profiling. Do you guys know what proxy data is? It's like, if I live in 98105 and drive a Volvo, it knows that I'm liberal. So they'll use that information to kind of surface more radical content in groups, because they can have a better picture of the extreme things that will appeal to you, which will lead to the production of and consumption of more sensationalist content, which leads to an increase in time spent on the platform. Now, the YouTube creator Matt Lee told The Guardian in 2018, he said, divisive content is king of online media today, because anything that riles you up and is toxic is when the algorithm loves you most. So I don't know if you guys, so I did a search before I was giving a different talk at IXTA. I was doing the search for vaccines on YouTube, and I just let autoplay run, and I was like, so I can't believe it. I was like actually surprised. After doing all this research, I was still surprised that within 20 minutes, it was like straight up in anti-vaxxer territory. It started out with informational videos like from UCLA Health, and then it just like was a downward spiral almost instantaneously. View. No matter what you think about anti-vaccination, is a very fringe point of view, and it got me there in 20 minutes and 5 videos. That's really saying something about how the recommendation engine works. There was a piece just this Sunday in the New York Times where the excellent technology reporter, Kevin Roos, he analyzed several years of data from a single YouTube user. I can't remember his name. His last name is Kane, though. And he turned over his YouTube history to Kevin Roos, and he basically did an analysis of how he became radicalized online. All of the pink are the right-wing content that he viewed, and all of the purple are the intellectual dark web content that he viewed. And so it just encourages, it brings you further and further out, not because it wants you to become extreme, but because they just want you to spend more time on the platform. It's actually agnostic. So we did this again at the societal level, and we were thinking specifically about the impact on journalism when it comes to social media. So you have the mass death of regional independent press, and this was taken from a couple of studies, one from George Washington University, a researcher called Danny Hayes, and Jennifer Lawless of American University. So you have the mass death of regional independent press leads to the reduction of attention on local news and issues, leads to a reduction in local civic involvement, leads to a reduction in well-functioning government. It actually said when fewer, there's less media paying attention to what local government is doing, there's more graft. So what that leads to is a reduction in trust in government and democracy because people start thinking, well, even my local government is corrupt, which leads to a rise of populist governments, which leads to populist government targeting the press, which leads to further mass death of regional and independent press. And you see this play out, not just, I mean, when we say populist, we're thinking automatically of our, administration, but it plays out in a far more extreme way in places like the Philippines. So Duterte, the president there, has used Facebook as a weapon in terms of like turning trolls onto journalists. And this is Maria Reza, who's been arrested 2 times this year now and a few times last year. And so it's become a really dangerous environment for free speech. So using all those kinds of what we would call the symptoms of the system, we then identify root cause. Like, why are all of those things happening? I think we can kind of pretty much assume that there's a straight line, right? So if you look at time spent on platform, that leads to attention to sell. And Tim Wu is a writer who's done a lot, who's written a lot around how our attention is sold online. And that leads to an increase in advertising revenue, which leads to further investment in growth of the company and the platform, which leads to an increase of user-based growth, which leads to precision and micro-targeting, which leads to sensationalist content driving engagement, which leads to time spent on platform. Not that you need to understand the whole thing, but basically within the root cause loop, the two root causes are time spent on platform and user-based growth. And in fact, a lot of social media companies look at user-based growth. It's almost like monthly active users and daily active users have become separate from profit. And I think maybe it's not even in social media companies, it's also in companies like Uber, right? Because you get into an Uber and every ride is subsidized. And that's because they're chasing user growth at the expense of revenue. So it's kind of funny how those have actually become disentangled. It's actually kind of topsy-turvy if you think about it. So even though we went ahead and, it's not loading. Even though we went ahead and did this and just you can see it categorically and you can look at the whole system online, we wanted to think about okay, well, as a designer, I'm not going to use this system to look explicitly at how I'm going to actively disrupt loops. I kind of don't have the time to do that kind of analysis in order to see the cascading effects. But I think this is a good way as a lead-in to more of an explicit human-centered design perspective. So the last thing we did was prioritize types of interventions. Now, we came up with 3. Not all of them are product or service oriented, but I think that's part of the point of doing system analysis is that you have to be able to look at policy as a good example of design. So thoughtful regulation and policy change would be one, reforming how social networks measure success is another, and a new philosophy of user experience and behavioral incentives. And so I can talk a little bit about each of these. We gave ourselves how might we questions. So how might policymakers create an environment in which data privacy is a fundamental human right? And how might government foster industry competition? And then we looked at, like, specifically which nodes in the root cause would these approaches, if done right, would disrupt. And you kind of see a lot of these ideas gaining traction now. So in March, I spoke at UX Copenhagen, and like the big news there was just like how everyone was dealing with GDPR and how user experience and product design has changed as a result of that. And the key thing about GDPR is that it really looks at data privacy as a fundamental human right, which is really different than how we look at data privacy in the States. It's a commodity. And in terms of growth or fostering competition, you see even people like Chris Hughes, who's co-founder of Facebook, who left, and then basically the next week just, I don't know, threw a grenade at the company basically by writing a huge opinion piece in the New York Times saying it's time to break up Facebook. So all the wolves are coming out and being like, break it up. Elizabeth Warren is also on that. And then you see it manifested also in product design. So this is, I'm sure you guys have seen this if you have an iPhone or a Mac. It's Apple's data and privacy screen. And what's notable about this is that they actually have a line in there that says, Apple believes privacy is a fundamental human right, so every Apple product is designed to minimize the collection and use of your data. And that's really significant, because once you start thinking about something as a human right, you stop thinking about it as monetizable. So it's an interesting move, and it's a move in the right direction. So you see some of these interventions already happening. The second one is reforming how social media or social networks measure success. So how might investors create metrics that emphasize quality rather than quantity of both user engagement and growth? And how might social media companies innovate on business models that are not advertising dependent? So when we talk about user engagement and growth, it's kind of like ties back to the thing I said earlier about not just companies like Facebook or YouTube, but companies like Uber, like they're chasing user growth at the expense of almost basically everything else. So oftentimes they leave up lots of like questionable or toxic content because it continues to draw engagement, right? And that's another thing is we decided to call on our map we decided not to use the term engagement, we use the term time spent on platform, because I think engagement is actually a euphemism for you spending way too much time on your phone or on social media. So this was interesting. Facebook has continued to let the anti-vax propaganda just rage on its platform. I mean, we have an outbreak going on here now. It's just insane. I mean, it's a good example of how information is actually dangerous to public health when it's misinformation. But Pinterest, they did an interesting thing. So they've been trying to solve this problem with machine learning, trying to identify what's misinformation, what's not. And eventually they're just like, holy crap, this is like crazy. And we just don't want to encourage the spread of this. So they actually took down anything that, anything related to the search term vaccine or vaccination, because they're like, we're gonna just take it down until we figure it out. So I'm not suggesting that's necessarily a long-term solution from an information standpoint, but it takes a lot of courage to take down something that may actually reduce the time people spend on your platform. And so I feel like this was a long-term play in terms of just their values and the health of their platform. So another way that you see this intervention manifesting is, does anyone know what a zebra is when it comes to companies? It's like the unicorn metaphor taken too far. But anyway, unicorn is like a startup with a $1 billion valuation. There's so many of them now, like can't even count. But there's this growing movement of people who are trying to start zebra companies, and they call them zebra companies because they're black and white, so they're profitable, but they're also good for society. Yeah, it's kind of a ridiculous metaphor, but the idea is that their focus is on sustainable long-term growth and not short-term hyper-growth. So if you've ever I actually sat in on a Facebook quarterly call. No, wait, I listened to it after the fact, now that I think about it. And it was like, it's all about MAUs, monthly active users. So knowing that, there's this movement for companies to focus on more long-term growth rather than like that quarterly hit of like more users, it can prevent them from going to places where they don't have the right context. Like Facebook should not be in Myanmar, right? They should not be in places where they don't have representation or people on the ground. So I think this is like a positive move in the right direction when it comes to interventions. Lastly, we have a new philosophy of user experience and behavioral incentives. So how might social media companies design for bridging diverse people rather than polarizing and driving them apart? And how might social media companies use behavior change models to steer towards healthy relationships with their products? So from a product perspective, you see things now, like for bridging diverse people, you see things like Causal, which like takes certain ideas and you can post pros and cons for them. I don't think it's a perfect system because like I don't always know where these opinions are coming from or if anything's being gained, but it's an interesting model in exposing people to different ideas. I think one of the key problems that we found with social media as it exists today is it's really good at helping people bond with like-minded people in order to kind of like trash people who are not like them. And so that's like super like how people bond, right? Like it's like an actual like evolutionary thing. We're tribal. And so it exacerbates that tendency rather than trying to bridge diverse people. So if you live in a diverse city, you're more likely in real life to encounter diverse people, but that's not going to happen to you on these big platforms because they encourage you to stay on the platform by having your views reinforced and by bonding with people who are like you. You see some good ideas coming out also in the product space. You have like, so many apps have this now. This was on Instagram, where you can manage your time and get a reminder to let you know you've been using it too much. These are kind of like small steps, but they're kind of like maybe pressured steps in the right direction. And then there are sort of bigger movements such as the Center for Humane Technology, which is really pushing for time well spent. So being able to understand the usage and to help product creators like understand the kinds of toxic products that they're creating and the fact that they're addictive, addressing those by way of just criticism and new principles and how they should be operating and more ethical tech. This is kind of like a growing movement. So just to reiterate, the process that we used was to use systems mapping to understand the status quo, to be able to identify root cause, and then be able to prioritize types of interventions. And once you can prioritize these types of interventions, then you can go into a design process that suits you to kind of design for that. So my question for you is, how do you see yourself using systems thinking, or how are you using it now? And yeah, I'd love to know what you guys think about this, or you think that is applicable in what you're doing today. And this is where you can kind of find, if you feel like reading a 50-page white paper, be my guest. I actually met a couple of people, so we had this event called All Tech is Human in May, and I met a couple of people who had read it, and I was like, you're the one. Read it, cover to cover. Thank you.